The great hall held its breath as Alpha King Dino Webb walked past the realm's most exquisite noblewomen, leaving shattered ambitions in his wake. He didn't want perfection or power. Instead, he stopped before the trembling, scarred servant girl cowering in the shadows, the one woman who never spoke a word. The wind howling around the stone spires of Winterbourne Keep sounded like a mourning wolf, a fitting prelude to a night built on archaic traditions and forced alliances. It was the year of our Lord 1247, and the great mating feast was underway. For centuries, the werewolf packs of the continent had abided by the Blood Moon Compact, a sacred truce where the supreme Alpha King was expected to choose a queen from the highest-born females of the allied territories. King Dino Webb sat upon a throne forged from blackened iron and oak, his posture rigid, his golden eyes scanning the sea of silk, jewels, and desperate ambition below him. At 28, Dino was a legend forged in brutality and blood. He had unified the fractured packs of the north and the southern valleys, ending decades of civil war. But peace was a fragile, demanding beast, and his counselors, chief among them, the grizzled Lord Thomas Redfern, relentlessly reminded him that a king without an heir was a kingdom waiting to bleed. The great hall was illuminated by hundreds of tallow candles, casting flickering shadows over the roaring hearths. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, spiced wine, and the cloying, overwhelming perfumes of the women who paraded before him. They were the daughters of Alpha bloodlines, bred for power, their smiles practiced, their wolves preening just beneath the surface of their human skin. Chief among the hopefuls was Garnet Sinclair, the undisputed jewel of the Western Vales. Tall, with cascading raven hair and eyes like chipped emeralds, she moved with the predatory grace of a born huntress. When she knelt before the dais, the silk of her crimson gown pooling like blood on the stone floor, the entire hall fell into a hushed reverence. The Sinclair pack was wealthy, commanding the largest army next to Dino's own. A union between them was the logical political choice. It was what the council demanded. But as Dino looked down at Garnet, his inner beast let out a low, disinterested rumble. Her scent was sharp, crushed roses layered over cold ambition. There was no warmth there, no tether pulling at his soul. He gave her a polite, entirely devoid nod, signaling her to rise and step aside. Garnet's perfect smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flash of pure, unadulterated venom crossing her emerald eyes before she masked it with practiced grace. Off in the dark periphery of the hall, far from the warmth of the hearths and the glittering eyes of the nobility, stood Brooklyn Jones. She was not there as a candidate. She was there because she was useful for carrying the heavy silver pitchers of wine, a beast of burden in a coarse woolen dress. Brooklyn was the illegitimate daughter of Lord Arthur Jones, a minor alpha of the Eastern Marches. In the brutal hierarchy of their kind, weakness was a sin punishable by exile or death. Brooklyn was considered the ultimate weakness. She was mute. When she was merely 7 years old, a band of rogues had breached their ancestral home. Her mother had hidden Brooklyn inside a heavy oak wardrobe before being torn apart just inches away. Brooklyn had remained locked in that dark, blood-soaked space for 3 days. When she was finally found, her voice was gone. The healers claimed her vocal cords were entirely intact, but the trauma had built an impenetrable wall in her mind. She had not uttered a single sound, not a cry, not a laugh, not even a whimper in 15 years. To Lord Arthur, a daughter who could not speak, could not command, and could not howl, was a curse. He stripped her of her noble title, relegated her to the servants' quarters, and brought her to Winterbourne only to tend to his legitimate favored daughters. Brooklyn kept her head bowed, her dark, untamed hair falling like a curtain over her face to hide the pale, heart-shaped curve of her jaw and the faint, silvery scar that cut across her left cheek, a gift from her father's riding crop, when she had once failed to bow quickly enough. She moved silently along the walls, her senses overwhelmed by the aggressive posturing of the wolves around her. She wanted nothing more than to retreat to the cold, quiet kitchens, away from the terrifying intensity of the Alpha King. She watched from the shadows as Dino rejected maiden after maiden. He was terrifyingly beautiful, a giant of a man with broad shoulders, dark hair worn long in the warrior's style, and a jaw carved from granite. But it was his eyes that frightened and fascinated her. They were ancient, weary, and entirely devoid of hope. "More wine, you useless creature," A harsh whisper hissed in her ear. It was Garnet Sinclair, who had stepped away from the dais and now stood near the shadows, her pride wounded, seeking a target for her ire. Brooklyn flinched, her hands trembling as she lifted the heavy silver pitcher to pour into Garnet's goblet. In her nervousness, a single drop of the crimson liquid splashed onto the floor, narrowly missing the hem of Garnet's gown. With a speed born of pure malice, Garnet backhanded Brooklyn. The sharp ruby ring on the noblewoman's finger caught Brooklyn's lip, tearing the tender flesh. Brooklyn fell hard against the stone wall, the pitcher clattering loudly to the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous hall. The music stopped. The chatter died. Every predatory eye in the room turned toward the shadows. Dino's patience had already been worn down to a fraying thread. The endless parade of sycophants made his skin crawl. When the loud crash echoed from the back of the hall, his wolf snapped to attention. He rose from his iron throne, towering over the assembly. What is the meaning of this disruption? Dino's voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. It carried the absolute crushing weight of his alpha command. Garnet immediately adopted a mask of startled innocence, pressing a hand to her chest. "My apologies, Your Grace." A clumsy, half-witted servant dropped the wine. "She is a mute, a defective thing from the Jones line. She shall be dealt with." Lord Arthur Jones stepped forward, his face pale with humiliation and rage. "Forgive the intrusion, my king. I will have the girl severely punished and removed from your sight immediately." Dino's eyes locked onto the dark corner. His heightened senses bypassed the stench of the spilled wine and the fearful sweat of the crowd. Beneath it all, a sudden, inexplicable scent hit him like a physical blow. It was faint, almost buried under the ash of the hearths. It smelled of rain-drenched earth, wild honey, and a sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood. Dino's heart seized. The great ancient beast residing within his soul, the spirit of the wolf that had slumbered in apathetic depression for years, suddenly reared up, thrashing against his ribs. "Mine." The single primal word echoed in Dino's mind with such ferocity that he actually staggered a half-step forward. The mate bond. It was a legend, a rare mythical tether that most modern wolves dismissed as romanticized folklore. Alphas mated for power now, not destiny. Yet, here it was, pulling at him with the force of a tidal wave. Ignoring the bewildered stares of his council and the expectant, nervous faces of the nobility, Dino descended the stone steps of the dais. The crowd parted for him like water before the prow of a warship. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his eyes fixed on the shadows where Garnet Sinclair stood. Garnet's heart soared. She thought, in her boundless arrogance, that the king was coming to defend her honor, to personally address the slight against the highest-ranking female in the room. She stood taller, a triumphant smile gracing her full lips. Dino didn't even look at her. He walked right past Garnet, leaving her standing frozen in shock, and stopped before the trembling figure huddled against the cold stone wall. Brooklyn was curled into herself, her hand pressed over her bleeding mouth, her wide, terrified eyes staring up at the giant of a man looming over her. She recognized the scent of him: pine needles, ozone, and dark, intoxicating power. It terrified her. She pressed her back harder against the wall, wishing the stone would swallow her whole. Dino dropped to one knee, a gesture so shocking that a collective gasp ripped through the great hall. An Alpha King knelt for no one. "Look at me," Dino said, his voice entirely stripped of its former harshness. It was a gentle, rumbling plea. Brooklyn squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. She was waiting for the blow, waiting for the punishment her father had promised. Slowly, gently, Dino reached out. His large, calloused fingers, hands that had snapped the necks of rival warlords, cupped her chin with agonizing tenderness. He tilted her face upward, forcing her to open her eyes. When Brooklyn's deep, expressive brown eyes met Dino's glowing golden ones, the world simply ceased to exist for the Alpha King. He saw the depths of her trauma, the crushing weight of her silence, and the beautiful, unbroken core of her spirit beneath the scars. He felt the phantom pain of her torn lip as if it were his own. He brushed his thumb over her uninjured cheek, wiping away a stray tear. "What is your name, little wolf?" he asked softly. Brooklyn just stared, paralyzed. Lord Arthur Jones, terrified that his disgraced daughter was somehow offending the king, rushed forward. "Your Grace, step away! She is Brooklyn, my bastard. She is mute and touched in the head. She cannot answer you. A low, terrifying growl ripped from Dino's chest, freezing Lord Jones in his tracks. Dino stood, pulling Brooklyn up with him, keeping one protective arm wrapped tightly around her small waist. He pulled her against his side, his body acting as a living shield. "She is Brooklyn," Dino declared, his voice booming through the silent hall, vibrating with absolute authority. "And you will address her with the respect she commands." He looked out over the sea of shocked faces, his eyes locking onto Lord Redfern, then Garnet, and finally the trembling Lord Jones. "The Blood Moon Compact demands I choose a queen to stand by my side," Dino said, his voice ringing like a struck bell. "The gods have spoken. The ancestors have chosen. This woman, Brooklyn Jones, is my true mate. She will be your queen." The silence that followed was absolute. For a long, agonizing moment, no one dared to breathe. Then, chaos erupted. "Preposterous!" The shout came from Garnet's father, Lord Silas Sinclair, a hulking brute of a man whose face was flushed dark purple with rage. "This is an insult to the Blood Moon, to the noble houses, and to my daughter. You would pass over the purest bloodlines for a defective, voiceless bastard?" Dino's eyes flashed a lethal, incandescent gold. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. He took a single step toward Lord Sinclair, keeping Brooklyn tucked behind him. "Watch your tongue, Sinclair," Dino warned, his voice a low, lethal purr. "The next man who calls my mate defective will leave this hall without his head." The bond of the fates is not subject to political debate. The uproar was deafening. Whispers of witchcraft, dark magic, and madness swept through the hall. How could the great Alpha King, a man of unmatched martial prowess, be tethered to a broken girl who scrubbed floors? Brooklyn stood frozen, her mind spinning into a terrifying abyss. She clutched the rough wool of her skirt, her chest heaving as a panic attack threatened to consume her. She was thrust into the blinding spotlight, the exact place she had spent 15 years trying to avoid. She looked up at Dino's broad back. He was risking his crown, his alliances, perhaps his very life, for a girl he had just met. Why? Lord Thomas Redfern, the king's most trusted advisor, stepped forward, his weathered face etched with deep concern. "Your Grace," he said carefully, keeping his voice low so only Dino and Brooklyn could hear. "This will fracture the Pax. The Sinclairs will not accept this humiliation. To make a queen of an unproven female, she must be tested. The laws demand she participate in the Blood Moon hunt to prove she is fit to lead the pack." Dino scowled, his fangs elongating slightly. "She is my mate. That is proof enough." "Not for them," Redfern replied grimly, nodding toward the furious nobility. "If you force this without observing the rites, there will be civil war by winter." Dino's jaw tightened. He knew Redfern was right. He turned back to Brooklyn. The sight of her bruised lip and wide, terrified eyes made his chest ache. He reached down, lacing his fingers through hers. Her skin was freezing, her hands rough with calluses from years of labor, but to Dino, it was the touch of salvation. "I am ending the feast," Dino announced loudly, his command brooking no argument. "Lord Redfern, see that the Lady Brooklyn is given chambers in the royal wing. Any disrespect shown to her will be treated as high treason." As Dino led her away, Brooklyn could feel the physical weight of 100 hateful glares burning into her back. Chief among them was Garnet Sinclair, whose eyes promised a slow, agonizing death. Over the next 3 days, Brooklyn's world was violently upended. She was moved from a damp cot in the scullery to a lavish suite adorned with velvet hangings and roaring fires. Servants who had once mocked her now kept their eyes glued to the floor as they bathed her in scented oils and dressed her in fine silks. Yet, beneath the luxury, Brooklyn felt like a canary locked in a golden cage, surrounded by cats. Dino visited her every evening. He was remarkably patient, never pushing her to speak, never demanding anything. He would sit by the fire, reading reports from his scouts, simply basking in her presence. His wolf was settled for the first time in a decade. He spoke to her of his childhood, of the burdens of the crown, filling the silence with his deep, soothing voice. Slowly, Brooklyn's terror began to ebb. She found herself watching the firelight dance across his sharp features, realizing that this terrifying warlord had a heart heavily burdened by loneliness. She began to communicate in small ways, a nod, a tilt of her head, the slight tightening of her hand in his. But outside their quiet sanctuary, venom was brewing. In the dark, damp cellars beneath Winterbourne, Garnet Sinclair met in secret with Lord Arthur Jones. The torches sputtered, casting long, demonic shadows against the stone walls. "Your daughter has humiliated me, Arthur," Garnet hissed, pacing the cellar floor like a caged predator. "The king is under some spell. A mate bond? Bah, it is a trick. He uses her to avoid marrying a woman with real power." Lord Jones wiped sweat from his brow, terrified of the Sinclair wrath. "My lady, I swear I had no part in this. I despise the girl. She brings nothing but shame to my house." "Then you will help me remove that shame," Garnet said, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. She stopped pacing and fixed Jones with a deadly glare. "Tomorrow is the blood moon hunt. The king's new mate is expected to run with the pack through the Whispering Woods. A dangerous place. So many steep ravines. Rogue wolves are known to prowl the borders." Jones swallowed hard, understanding the implication. "You mean to arrange an accident? She is weak, Arthur. She cannot shift. She cannot even scream for help," Garnet sneered. "During the chaos of the hunt, my loyal guards will separate her from the king's retinue. We will force her toward the Black Ravine. When they find her broken body at the bottom, it will be deemed a tragic failure of the trials. The pack will see that the ancestors rejected her weakness, and Dino will be forced to take a true mate." Jones hesitated. It was one thing to abuse his daughter. It was another to murder the king's claimed mate. But the threat in Garnet's eyes was absolute. If he refused, the Sinclairs would destroy his lands. "It will be done," Jones agreed, sealing a pact of blood in the darkness. The morning of the blood moon hunt arrived with a heavy, oppressive frost. The sky was the color of bruised iron, matching the mood of the gathering pack. Hundreds of wolves, shifted into their massive, feral forms, milled about the courtyard, their breath pluming in the freezing air. Brooklyn stood at the edge of the courtyard, wrapped in a heavy cloak of dark fur. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from the raw, predatory energy of the beasts around her. She knew the traditions. She was expected to run, in human form, alongside the wolves to prove her endurance and her worthiness to be their Luna. Dino approached her, his immense black wolf form towering over the others. He nudged her hand gently with his wet nose, a soft whine escaping his throat. He shifted back to his human form effortlessly, standing naked and unbothered by the cold before pulling a tunic over his shoulders. "You do not have to do this," Dino told her quietly, taking her face in his hands. "I can cancel the trial. I do not care what the council says." Brooklyn looked up at him. She saw the worry in his golden eyes, the fear that he might lose the one thing that had finally brought him peace. But she also saw the sneering faces of the nobles gathered behind him. She saw her father, looking at her with thinly veiled disgust. She saw Garnet, clad in hunting leathers, her eyes gleaming with dark anticipation. If Brooklyn ran now, if she hid behind Dino's protection, she would forever be the weak, defective mute. Dino's reign would be plagued by rebellion, all because of her. For the first time in 15 years, a spark of pure, unadulterated defiance ignited in Brooklyn's chest. She reached up, placing her small hands over Dino's large ones. She gave him a firm, resolute shake of her head. She would not hide. Dino's chest swelled with pride. He kissed her forehead softly. "Stay close to me," he commanded. As the hunting horns blew, a deafening cacophony of howls tore through the sky. The pack surged forward, a tidal wave of fur, muscle, and teeth, plunging into the dark, foreboding depths of the Whispering Woods. Brooklyn ran. Her breath burned in her lungs, branches whipping at her face and tearing her clothes. The sheer speed of the wolves was terrifying, but she pushed her human legs to their absolute limit, keeping her eyes fixed on the massive black wolf leading the charge. But the woods were ancient and treacherous, filled with sudden fogs and twisting paths. As they plunged deeper into a dense thicket, the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally. Suddenly, a group of 3 large gray wolves, Garnet's loyalists, surged from the flanks, deliberately cutting across Brooklyn's path. They snarled, snapping their jaws inches from her legs, forcing her off the main trail. Before Dino could turn back, a massive, orchestrated commotion erupted at the front of the pack. A scent of rogue wolves, planted by Garnet's men, threw the vanguard into a frenzy. In the chaos of roaring and snapping jaws, Dino lost sight of Brooklyn. Driven off the path, Brooklyn stumbled down a steep, rocky incline. The three gray wolves flanked her, herding her like a terrified sheep toward the jagged edge of the black ravine. She tripped over an exposed root, falling hard onto the frozen earth, scraping her palms bloody. She scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, until her heel met empty air. She was at the edge of the cliff. The river roared hundreds of feet below, a violent ribbon of white water and jagged rocks. The three wolves advanced slowly, their eyes glowing with murderous intent, lips peeled back to reveal razor-sharp fangs. There was no escape. There was no Dino to save her. As the lead wolf lunged, aiming to knock her over the precipice, Brooklyn closed her eyes. But she did not die. Instead, a force deep within her, a power suppressed by a decade of trauma, a lineage her father had desperately tried to hide, snapped awake. The silence that had imprisoned her for 15 years shattered. Brooklyn opened her eyes, and they were not brown. They were glowing, blinding, ethereal silver. She opened her scarred mouth, and the sound that ripped from her throat was not a scream. It was an alpha's roar. The sound that erupted from Brooklyn's scarred throat defied every known law of their kind. It was not the frantic, high-pitched scream of a terrified human girl, nor was it the standard, aggressive challenge of an ordinary wolf. It was a concussive, resonant shockwave, a booming, ethereal frequency that rattled the very bedrock of the black ravine and shattered the frost clinging to the ancient pines. The three massive gray wolves, mid-lunge and fully intent on tearing her throat out, were slammed out of the air by the sheer physical force of that sonic command. They hit the frozen earth with pathetic yelps, their lethal momentum entirely neutralized. Their ears pinned flat against their skulls, and an immediate, instinctual terror overrode their conditioning. This was not a command from a rival. This was the primordial voice of a living god. For Brooklyn, the world dissolved into a blinding tempest of agonizing heat and brilliant light. The invisible dam inside her mind, the iron vault where she had buried her voice, her trauma, and her true nature for 15 agonizing years blew apart. Her mother's final, desperate whisper in that blood-soaked wardrobe suddenly echoed with perfect clarity in her mind. "You are the last of the Silver Crest, my brave girl. Hide your light until the true king calls for it." Brooklyn's spine arched at an impossible angle as the human shell she had worn like a suffocating shroud began to fracture. There was no pain in the shift, only the euphoric, explosive release of an entity that had been caged in darkness for far too long. Her coarse woolen dress shredded into confetti as her bones elongated and her muscles expanded with terrifying speed. The three assassins scrambled backward, their bellies scraping the dirt in ultimate submission, whining in abject horror at what was unfolding before them. Where the fragile, mute servant girl had stood just seconds ago, a beast of nightmare and legend now towered. Brooklyn had not just shifted. She had manifested as a creature straight out of the most sacred, forbidden tapestries of the Blood Moon ancestors. She was a silver alpha. Her form was breathtakingly massive, standing nearly as tall at the shoulder as Dino's own legendary black wolf. But it was her coat that stole the breath from the frozen air. She was not gray nor white, but a pure, iridescent, liquid silver that seemed to generate its own luminescent halo against the gloom of the whispering woods. Her eyes, once a soft, fearful brown, were now twin orbs of blazing, incandescent starlight. She took a single, earth-shaking step toward the cowering assassins. She did not need to snarl. The sheer, crushing aura of her dominance brought the three seasoned warriors to their bellies. They whined, exposing their throats, begging for a mercy they did not deserve. Miles away, at the front of the hunting pack, Dino had just ripped the throat out of the final rogue wolf planted to distract him. He stood panting, his muzzle dripping with crimson, when the sonic shockwave of Brooklyn's roar hit him. The sound vibrated through the marrow of his bones. His own inner beast, usually a chaotic storm of violence and aggression, fell entirely still in absolute reverence. Luna, panic, absolute and overwhelming, seized Dino. He abandoned the vanguard, his massive black paws tearing up the frozen earth as he sprinted back the way he came. He moved faster than any wolf alive, a blur of dark fury tearing through the underbrush, guided by the desperate, frantic pull of the mate bond. If Garnet's loyalists had touched one hair on Brooklyn's head, he would burn the western vales to ash. He burst through the dense thicket at the edge of the black ravine, his claws skidding on the stone, his lips peeled back in a feral snarl, ready to slaughter everything in his path. Instead, Dino froze. The rest of the pack, drawn by the undeniable call of an ancient power, began to spill into the clearing behind him. Lord Thomas Redfern, Lord Arthur Jones, and finally, a smugly expectant Garnet Sinclair emerged from the tree line. Garnet had anticipated seeing a broken, bloody corpse at the bottom of the gorge. What they saw instead drove every single wolf in the clearing to their knees. There, standing at the precipice of the abyss, was a goddess of silver and starlight. At her massive, glowing paws lay Garnet's 3 elite guards, trembling like newborn pups, completely subjugated by Brooklyn's aura. Dino's breath hitched in his massive chest. He took a slow, reverent step forward. The silver wolf turned her massive head toward him. When her glowing starlight eyes met his golden ones, a tether of pure, unbroken magic solidified between their souls. There was no fear in her gaze anymore. Only power. Only equals. A choked, horrified gasp broke the silence. Garnet Sinclair fell backward into the snow, her face drained of all color, her arrogant facade shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Beside her, Lord Jones looked as though he had seen a ghost. He knew the legend of the Silver Crest, the sovereign bloodline thought to be hunted to extinction. He had mated with one, forcing her into hiding, suppressing her lineage out of his own pathetic insecurity. He had thought the trait died with his mate. He was terribly, fatally wrong. Dino shifted back to his human form, ignoring his own nakedness in the freezing cold. He walked slowly toward the magnificent silver beast. He reached out a blood-stained hand, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Brooklyn leaned forward and pressed her massive silken forehead against his chest. A deep, rumbling purr vibrated from her chest, warming Dino's freezing skin. He wrapped his arms around her thick neck, burying his face in her iridescent fur. "My queen," Dino whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion the Alpha King had not felt in decades. Pure, unadulterated awe. The return to Winterbourne Keep was a procession of stunned, reverent silence. The pack that had previously looked at Brooklyn with disgust and mockery now walked with their heads bowed, keeping a respectful distance from the majestic silver beast that trotted effortlessly beside their giant black king. When they reached the inner courtyard, Dino signaled for his royal cloak. Lord Redfern, his hands actually trembling with a mixture of fear and profound respect, draped the heavy black bear fur over Dino's shoulders. Dino turned to Brooklyn. "Shift for me, my heart," he murmured softly. With a flash of ethereal light that forced the onlookers to shield their eyes, the giant silver wolf dissolved. In her place stood Brooklyn. She was no longer the hunched, trembling servant girl in a coarse sackcloth. Though she stood naked in the freezing air, her posture was ramrod straight, her chin held high, and the scarred tissue on her lip now seemed like a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. Her eyes still held a lingering trace of that blinding silver light. Dino immediately stepped forward, pulling the massive fur cloak from his own shoulders and wrapping it securely around her delicate frame. He pulled her against his side, turning his lethal golden gaze upon the crowd. His eyes locked onto Garnet Sinclair, who was currently being held at spear point by Dino's elite royal guard, alongside the 3 assassins who had tried to push Brooklyn off the cliff. Lord Arthur Jones was on his knees a few feet away, weeping and begging for mercy from gods who were no longer listening. "Treason," Dino's voice boomed, echoing off the stone walls of the keep. The sheer malice in his tone made grown warriors flinch. "An assassination attempt on your Luna, a direct violation of the Blood Moon truce." Garnet, desperate and unhinged, thrashed against the guards holding her arms. "She is a freak, a mutant. You cannot prove anything." My guards acted on their own. They smelled weakness and the wolf instinct took over. You cannot condemn the House of Sinclair for the actions of rogue animals. Dino drew his broadsword, the heavy steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. The air grew heavy, thick with the promise of imminent slaughter. "I am the king. I need no proof other than the scent of your deceit. I will take your head, Garnet, and I will mount it on the gates of the Western Vales as a warning to any who dare question my mate." He took a step forward, raising the massive blade. Garnet squeezed her eyes shut, a pathetic sob finally breaking through her arrogant sneer. But before the sword could fall, a small, pale hand reached out and wrapped around Dino's thick wrist. Dino stopped instantly, the bloodlust draining from his eyes as he looked down at Brooklyn. She gently pushed his arm down, lowering the blade. She stepped out from the shelter of his side, the heavy fur cloak dragging against the cobblestones. She walked slowly toward Garnet and her father, Lord Jones. The entire courtyard held its collective breath. What could the silent girl possibly do? Brooklyn stopped in front of the woman who had tormented her, who had struck her, who had orchestrated her murder. She looked down at Garnet, and then over to her father, the man who had treated her worse than a feral dog for 15 years because he was terrified of the power sleeping in her blood. Brooklyn took a deep breath. Her chest expanded, and she opened her mouth. Death is too quick a mercy for a coward. The voice that echoed through the courtyard was unlike anything they had ever heard. It was slightly raspy from 15 years of disuse, carrying a haunting, melodic gravel, but it was amplified by the raw, undeniable alpha power radiating from her soul. It commanded absolute obedience. Garnet's eyes flew open in sheer terror. Lord Jones collapsed completely, pressing his face into the freezing mud. She could speak. The silent girl had found her voice, and it was the voice of a sovereign. Brooklyn turned her glowing gaze to Lord Thomas Redfern. The laws of the blood moon demand a life for a royal life, but I will not begin my reign with the stench of Sinclair blood on my boots. It breeds rebellion. She turned back to Garnet and her father, her expression a mask of beautiful, terrifying ice. Garnet Sinclair, you and your father, Lord Silas Sinclair, are entirely stripped of your titles, your lands, and your armies. You are hereby banished to the barren wastes of the far north. If you, or any of your loyalists, ever cross south of the frost line again, you will be hunted for sport. Garnet opened her mouth to argue, to scream her defiance, but the sheer weight of Brooklyn's silver aura forced the words back down her throat. She could only nod, weeping in utter devastation. She had aimed for the throne, and she was leaving as a destitute exile. Brooklyn then stepped toward her father, Arthur Jones. He didn't dare look up at her. "As for you," Brooklyn said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper that only he and Dino could hear. "You knew who my mother was. You knew what I was. You hid me in the dirt because you were a weak, pathetic man afraid of a strong woman. You are no longer an alpha. You will return to the eastern marshes, and you will live out the rest of your miserable days in the very scullery you forced me to clean. You are nothing." Jones let out a pathetic wail, but Brooklyn had already turned her back on him. She walked back to Dino, who was watching her with an expression of such intense pride and burning devotion that it made her breath catch. He sheathed his sword and dropped to one knee in the blood-stained snow. "My king," Brooklyn whispered, a small, genuine smile finally gracing her scarred lips. "You do not kneel to me." "I do," Dino replied, his golden eyes shining with absolute reverence. He reached out, taking her cold, scarred hand, and pressed a tender kiss to her knuckles. "I kneel to the Silver Queen, the true Luna of the realms." Following their king's lead, Lord Redfern dropped to his knees, bowing his head. Then the royal guard followed, then the nobility. Like a wave of cascading dominoes, hundreds of the most vicious, proud werewolves on the continent sank into the snow, bowing before the servant girl they had mocked just hours before. The Alpha King had rejected every painted beauty and wealthy heiress for the silent, scarred girl in the shadows. He had wagered his crown on a whisper of a bond, trusting his soul over the council's politics. And in doing so, he had awakened a legend. As the first rays of the dawn sun crested over the stone spires of Winterbourne Keep, bathing the courtyard in golden light, Brooklyn stood tall beside her king. She was silent no more, a broken girl forged by pain into an unbreakable queen, ready to lead an empire. If you were captivated by Brooklyn and Dino's epic tale of betrayal, hidden powers, and destined mates, don't let the story end here. We bring you the most intense, heart-stopping werewolf romance dramas every single week. Hit that like button if you loved Brooklyn's ultimate revenge. Share this video with your fellow fantasy romance addicts, and subscribe to our channel right now so you never miss out on another legendary alpha romance. Your support keeps the pack growing.